Even just the conversation, I've got an addictive personality, that covers
Oh,
everything. It's like,
yes.
I'm like, there's no such thing as an addictive
Do you believe
personality.
it? Do you
So
think there is or there isn't? I feel like I grapple with this as well.
I don't see the evidence to argue that there is an addictive personality. I think there are addictive parts to a person's personality, but an addictive personality, no, I don't think that there is an all-encompassing. Now, why would I say this? I have to look at the data. I have to look at what makes up a personality. The best conceptualization of a personality we have are the big five personality traits. So for those who aren't aware of the personality traits, best acronym is OCEAN. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is also named negative emotion or what have you. Now, in what part of that personality conceptualization does addiction lie? You
Mm.
could say that openness to experience may predispose a person to do experientially important things that lead to them developing an addiction, or neuroticism leads to overwhelming feelings that make a person more likely to experience an addiction. Is there an addictive personality? I'm not convinced that there is an addictive personality. I think maybe a person is so blended to a particular part of themselves, and that part is so undifferentiated, that they see themselves as that part. And I think this is where IFS, that this parts therapy, can become really important, where you differentiate these different parts and say, okay, yeah, there is a part of me that struggles with addiction, but there is no addictive personality.
I'm in two minds. I feel when I'm not in psychologist mode, I'm like, oh, it's just a cop out. Like, it's just easy to say, I have an addictive personality, give me all the drugs. But then in therapy, my hypothesis on it is that people have a vulnerability to having, quote unquote, an addictive personality. They're vulnerable to it because maybe they have undiagnosed ADHD and they're self-medicating. And then they think, well, I just have an addictive personality. I love caffeine, I love methamphetamines, give me all the stuff. But there's an underlying vulnerability they're not aware of that makes them more susceptible to choosing the addiction pathway, whereas it's not a personality, it's not who they are, it's a vulnerability. So I agree with you in that sense.
Yeah, and I think it's semantics, perhaps, where we're just like we're calling it one thing or another. But I think it becomes destructive in the same way that the word addict becomes destructive in 12-step programs, for example. I have an issue with somebody calling themselves an addict, and I work with people who have had tons of addictions, and that's one of my that's one of my bread and butter, that I help people through that. And I don't like the conceptualization of I'm an addict, or even when I'm not using a substance. I think that it conflates the part of you that
Mm.
struggles with this, to use your words. There's an underlying vulnerability there. I think it conflates that with who the person is.
Yes, yes, for sure. And it just gets easy to just lump yourself in that category. Oh, I'm an addict. I have an addictive personality. That's just who I am. And I think it prevents people from being able to change.
And in fact, Roy Baumeister did a bit of work around this, the social psychologist, and he wrote a book on willpower, psychological concept of willpower, which basically the concept of willpower is that popular concept, but the way that they study it is self-regulation. So
Mm.
how much is a person able to regulate their behavior in light of temptation? So grabbing a hand grip and squeezing the hand grip, and even though their brain's telling them you got to let go right now because you're too tired, your mental ability to hold on to it, even though you're everything's telling you to, or in the cold shower, another example. So you can actually measure self-regulation in terms of how a person is able to regulate their behavior. But what he said in one of his papers, I spoke with him a few years back. He sent me a paper that was focusing on the concept of addiction. And he mentioned that people who define themselves as having a brain disorder in relation to addiction tend to be a lot less uh, motivated to change, because they see themselves as suffering from an affliction rather than having an ability or a potential towards mastery of that action. And this is where that brain disease model of addiction becomes quite hairy, because it is a very popular model. And in fact, it's the model that drives 12-step programs. And when a person just glues themselves to the I have a brain disease, then what we see is that even when they're not using a substance, they're still what AA would call dry drunks. They're still doing everything the same as they would usually be doing, but they're just not drinking alcohol.
I want to talk about that. So, do you believe that a person who was previously an alcoholic or someone who's overcome an addiction to alcohol, do you think sobriety is the answer? Because I've asked this to people and they're like, yeah, like there's something just with alcoholism. They just can't touch it. They can't stop. Do you think a person who struggles with alcoholism can ever get to the point in their life of having one drink?
I think, okay, so my experience, and this is, again, I'm going to base this off my clinical experience and of the data that I've come across. I think there are certain varieties of people who use alcohol, as I'm sure you do. There are people who have a predisposition towards alcohol use but never use alcohol, and there are people who have a predisposition towards alcohol use, and you can think about from an epigenetic point of view, that genetic predisposition, and then they use alcohol. It's often within this demographic that these individuals can become more and more addicted and chronically use a particular substance. Now, I tend to approach treatment in a few ways. I usually try to do some psychological and behavioral interventions when a person's coming up to me. Okay, let's try this. And if this doesn't work, let's try this. And if this doesn't work, let's try this. And so we try to resource people and try to work people and taper people down from their substance use. If a person is having a high level of difficulty to taper down on their own, then they need some additional help, like a detoxification program or a residential rehabilitation program. In those situations, the brain generally takes between 2 to 6 months, from my understanding, for the brain to begin to change the neural networks that are laid down early on in alcoholism. Later on, it's almost impossible to change those neural networks after the 6-month period, even if you've stopped. Now, does that mean that things get better? Yes, things get better. They don't necessarily get worse, but that's to say that those neural networks tend to be laid down. And so to make this as simple as possible for our audience who might not be understanding your brain basically changes to anticipate a drink or or something. You have a particular feeling. You're like, oh, I need to have a drink. I'm going to a pub with the boys. Let me just have a drink, or I'm doing what have you. Now, in those individuals, I would say the evidence that I've come across says, yes, these are the individuals that I think should not go back to drinking, even one drink, because it reactivates the same neural circuitry. And I facetiously talk to my clients about I'd say, imagine you've cheated on your spouse for a few times, and you're like, no, I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop. And then you test yourself and say, okay, I'm going to test whether I've really stopped. So I'm going to go and cheat on my spouse just to make sure that I've really stopped cheating on my spouse. It tends to be that I see people who tend to have, I'm going to stop using alcohol when I've had such an issue with it. And now I'm going to test myself by using alcohol again. And then they go back to the same spiral.
Right.
Now, I'm being facetious when I say that, but I think the concept is, to highlight concepts, I usually go into extremes. So I'm like, think about it this way. What do you think about this? So to answer your question, I think there are some people that need to move forward in their life and arrange themselves in such a way that alcohol is just not part of their life anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
But is that for everyone? No, I don't think it is for everyone, because I mean, alcohol is a poison. The way that it transfers into the body, in the liver, it
Oh,
actually gets transferred into a carcinogenic compound that is significantly more harmful than ethanol, and it actually burns muscle and cell fibers inside the body. So that's, I mean, it's an interesting process.
it's so normalized as well. I find alcohol similar to caffeine. It's extremely normalized, and I hardly drink. And this year, I've really just stuck to that. And you notice how many people are dumbfounded by the fact you don't drink or you don't want to have a drink. It's almost you're the weird one. Why aren't you drinking? Or why don't you drink? And I'm like, bro, do you know what it's doing to your brain?
Yeah. Do you know what I do? When someone says that, I actually, so so if they keep pushing it to me, I'm like, why is it so important to you that I drink?
Mm,
So I just turn it back on them, because in my experience, when I say, oh, but this is what's going on, this is what's going on, that just doesn't work, you know? So you're trying to convert
yes.
someone who, yeah.
I think as well, reflecting on why are you drinking? What's your reason? I think the intention says a lot about the person or about what's going on for them or in their life. And I think if you're listening to this, I don't want to demonize drinking. It's fine in moderation. I'd like a glass of wine with steak or something like that, but it's not something I would intentionally choose to pursue in my life unless it had a real specific intended purpose with it.